Through the years, we've heard, don't use white. Just like we do when we get up in the morning, we have to go through ugly to get to beautiful. Look how different that is because I'm thinking in layers. You heard Ghostbusters? Well, I'm a myth buster today. We're going to break the myth of white pastel. Look how that just vibrates. There's a luminosity there. Look at that. If you're liking the content of this video, please hit the like button, even if you're a subscriber. It helps others find this content. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to show you how to break the rules of white, and we're going to break that myth of white pastel. Welcome back to another episode of Pastel with Avon. Today I am going to make you try to forget everything you learned about white pastel. White, don't use white, don't use white. We've been drilled with that. It's a myth. Primarily, we're trying to go for that opalescent look where there's multiple layers. I'm going to end up with 10 or 12 different layers of color with white mixed in. And then in my highlights, I'm going to show you how at the very end, if you're using texture or you're using mark making, very sparingly you add some white and you can make all those layers pop. White is used for tints. You add white to any hue and you get a tint. But today's video is going to unlock some forbidden knowledge because we are so used to the myth of how we use white or don't use white pastel. But I'm going to use white pastel for something more than creating tints. I'm going to show you how layering whites can create a much more interesting, much more luminescent finish to your highlights. And because I use texture, I am going to put white on at the very end, very sparingly, and you'll see how it pops against the multiple 10 or 12 layers of color that I create. We'll start out with this oil. So this is an oil study in plein air. Didn't take long, it's just an oil wash to create some of the atmosphere on that rainy morning about 10 o'clock. This is just clear gesso and white gesso in a taped off area that later I could use this and put a mat on it if I ever took this to a finish or something. So, but it's going to be what I use in this particular study. I'm going to try to capture some of the atmosphere, but I'm not going to copy this. I'm not going to enlarge this a lot. I'm going to take this up to, I think that this is an 11 by 14. This is a piece of Dick Blick canvas panel, and I prepped this panel by using some acrylics. I've prepped this panel using acrylics, and this gives me some texture. It's filled in a lot of that canvas because I am doing pastel. I want that canvas to absorb some of this pastel, but I don't want a canvas effect. I want a little bit of that canvas showing through, and it's still coming through. When I put pastel over some of these areas, you'll see that it's canvas in the finished painting. But I also want that heavy texture, which will help me create lights and darks using white over some dark. Now, dark is a relative term. You see that this is kind of a almost a yellow ochre mixed with white. So I am already using white in my ground. Rather than create a wash, I wanted these ridges, and I applied this thing with the side of a brush, and there's a few places that I used a palette knife to create some randomness here for this painting. So this, like I said, the darks, putting white over dark is relevant. This is dark in value compared to the whites that I'm going to put over this, and the tints that will go in with the whites. I am going to put my reference up above the painting out of view, but I'll be following that reference, and you can see that we're going to go from something of value and a color hue that is lighter because this is in the yellows, and we're going to be into the grays with some violets. Violet is opposite of yellow, so It's a process of thinking ahead when you want to use these forbidden white techniques. I'm just going to briefly show you in a spot here what I'm talking about. I'm taking this is a blue violet, and I really like the violet in this. And I'm going to put this on here, and it's not going to stick very well because I have not put any tooth yet on there. But I'm just going to demo how that yellow is coming through. Now, if I wanted a yellow violet, I could just as easily put a pale yellow down. The manufacturer's already included a lot of white in there, and then put some violet, blue violet over it, blend those two together, and I could end up with what I'm looking for in my fog. But what I'm really going to do is I'm going to use the white and put it over this yellow. Now look how much brighter that is in comparison to that pale yellow. And then use the blues over it and not blend it together, and then put some yellows and other tones over it. And you see our yellow is coming through. We put white on first, we put the blue violet over it, and this is so much more luminous because we have 4 layers going on here. The darker, we're putting light over dark. We have the darker, then we have the blue violet, then we have the white, which then mixes with our pale yellow. And it really brings up the intensity because of the shadow techniques in here. So that's what we're going after. So the first thing I've got to do is I've got to put some tooth on here, but I want you to see how that yellow is going to react as we go forward. This is a really dynamic effect using white. The forbidden white. Don't use white. Oh my gosh, don't use white. But I'm telling you, using white and using it in layers with putting it white under your darks, then putting white over your darks in some of the texture areas, and then coming back in with a pale accent of some color, whether it's yellow, it could be lime green, but look how that just vibrates. There's a luminosity there that you just can't get by first applying just the pale yellows and the violets. Let me tooth this thing up with some clear gesso. I'll wipe this all off and we'll start that process, but I wanted to show you that. As you can see, I'm using clear gesso. I use Liquitex. There's different makers. It has pumice in it. It will dry clear. It looks a little milky here. It'll have a little bit of a frosty coat on there, but not enough to interfere with that color coming through. And as you can see, it also goes on, just like I added that, that yellow ochre and it created ridges. We are also creating even more texture by applying this thick in spots. So let's let that dry and then we'll get started with the painting process. I got into a little of this pastel dust down in here and drug it across there. That's going to be my horizon, but I accidentally, before I realized it, had that on there, and I've got a little dark spot there and some down in here, but it shouldn't interfere with what we're trying to do. You'll still get that luminosity because I want that luminosity up in this part of the sky and this part of the water. So, okay, this has dried. I've got some tooth on it. As you can see, when the kind of frosty clear gesso is milky, it changes to a clear finish with some tooth. So I'm going to start with white. White is, a lot of times anybody that's watched my videos knows that I start with place setters, and I like to sometimes put in what is going to be some of the lightest areas just as a reminder, because as I use darker colors around it, darker hues, I'm sometimes wanting to be able to see and make sure that I have saved some of the areas that are going to be light. If I remember, I'll stick up on the screen the study, the plein air study, and you'll see off in the distance there are some, on the opposite shore, there are some houses. I would call them cabins, but at this particular lake, these are multi-million-dollar homes. Matter of fact, Jim Irsay's, the late Jim Irsay, his family has homes, has a home with a indoor swimming pool, and there's a private golf course at this particular location. I'm putting these place setters in so that as I build the color and the darker values around these, I will know to put my darkest values so I can create some contrast in some of these areas. This was where the sky was the lightest up along that ridge of trees that went along there. So I'll put some pure white in there as just kind of a place setter. Now I'm going to go into here, because I know that I'm going to have some contrast there and that distant shore of where the landscaping and the shrubs are. That distant shore is one of the darker areas. So we're going to go with a little darker hue. It's a blue that's got just a little bit of probably the manufacturer might have used some black in there to create a shade. So I'm going to go around some of these areas because these are distant homes. I keep wanting to say cottages. These are distant homes with a lot of greenery around them. But as you see in that study, we are going to go and keep it a lot lighter in value. But we have to establish these darks. We want to get dark against light, the same as any other painting, but because we're using white as a base, we're wanting to try to get some of that luminosity in some of the brighter areas. Now I'm going to put white in some of these other areas and show you, just as I did before we put the tooth on here, I'm going to show you how we build up that luminosity in those highlights. The same as you would build luminosity in a shadow, but you're working in reverse. Instead of using darks and sometimes shades, we're using tints, but we're using the white so that when it catches on some of this texture, those multiple layers will show through. This can be done with mark making. You just use your marks, your dark marks, if you're not into texture. I just happen to choose to use texture in order to create that variation that mark making does. It allows me to paint with the side of a pastel. If this was not heavily textured, I'd have to be making marks with various shapes and edges of my pastel and putting other marks beside them to create the same effect that I get by being able to broadly just paint across this texture. On the top of my sky, I'm not putting a lot on here, but we're going to put a little bit of that blue in there. Remember, the skies come up over us. The least amount of atmosphere that we have standing here and looking up at the sky, which is looking up this way, has the least amount of atmosphere between us and outer space. The further we go this way, back into it, the more atmosphere there is, the more particles of air, the more particles of moisture, and therefore we get some of the brighter areas near the horizon, and we get some of the most intense color. If it was a clear sky, we get some of the most intense color above us. So I'm putting a little bit of this blue up in here, and probably I'll get some violet up in there, because when I mix the whites and the tints with this, I want some of that purer hue to be overhead. Now I'm going to put a little violet in there, and I'm not pressing hard. This is a much softer pastel. Remember this one? This was a hard pastel. This is a soft pastel. So I don't have to press as hard in order to get it to stick on some of those ridges of texture that I've got. And the reflection, because it's furthest away from us, that's the furthest shore, has more violet in it. Again, atmospheric principles of more particles of water and dust and things in the air as we go towards a horizon versus overhead. Although two-dimensionally, this is just higher in the painting, it is much more overhead than there. Think of perspective going back this way. If this was a room, we would have our leading lines going out this way with the back of the room down in here and the front of the room in here. So it's all about perspective when we're dealing with color hues and we're dealing with those forbidden whites, those whites and how we use them to create those dynamic, that dynamic interest that we're looking for as it shines through. This is the paler blue violet that we had when I didn't have the tooth on there yet. I'm going to put some of that over there. And already you can see this is way, way too dark. But again, to make white work the way we want, and some of those special techniques that underutilized in your paintings, to be able to do this, we need to have these darks, these darker hues underneath. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to put that white over it. And again, my texture allows me to just paint with the side of the, so to speak, the side of the brush. Now right now it doesn't look like much. As I always say, when you get up in the morning, you don't look your best. So we have to go through, just like we do when we get up in the morning, we have to go through ugly to get to beautiful. Now look what happens when I blend these. I'm getting some of that yellow ochre. I'm getting some of that yellow ochre shining through in a lot of these places. There's where I kept the pure white. We got a little violet mixed into there. But we're able to transform this now closer to what the sample is. Now remember why I put my white markers in there? Because I'm rubbing a lot of dark that's next to it up against it. They're not going to stay in the shape of houses, but they are place setters to help me remember that this is where those houses, lake cottages, are. I suppose we can call them cottages, because if you're a millionaire and a billionaire and you've got, you know, a 15-room cottage on a lake, it probably is a cottage compared to your 24-room mansion that you live in to work from during the week. So we can call these cottages. They're just billionaire cottages. Now we're starting to get some of that ethereal effect. We've gotten some of this blue up into this white. We've gotten some of this violet, blue violet into this white. But we still have, because we started with white, we still have this as the brightest area, this in our cottages, against this line of trees on the far coast. And we still have some more intense blues in the sky overhead. But again, it's a foggy, misty morning on Lake Maxintucky, so we are going to eventually get there. But this is the layering process you go through in order to use those whites. Now I had that pale yellow. Yellow and violet make what? They make a gray. And look what happens when I drag that yellow over the lightest area compared to the violets. Because I'm using texture, or if you're using mark making, you're not filling in with this color completely. You're not filling in with any of these colors. You want them to play with one another. And depending how hard you press, depends how much of the color underneath comes through, or how much I press when I blend and the color comes underneath, comes through. Now I'm going to put, remember when we started, before we added the texture, I put white back over, but very lightly. I'm going to illustrate again how that pure white, just catching some of that texture, really can make that horizon shine, particularly when we go up against these trees. Look at that, look at that. Oh my gosh, and here I'm going to do the same thing by just dragging some of this pale yellow. The manufacturer adds white to some of these pastels. We do not know. Every manufacturer has a different formula to make their pale yellow. We don't know how much white is added. We don't know how much other pigments are added to create this pale yellow. I'm not privy to their formula. But typically your pales will be tints. And anytime you add white to a pure color hue, you get a tint. And all we're doing is we're highlighting some of those textured areas. Look at that. This is pure white against that pale. Look at that. That is what we're after. That's going to give us that ethereal, atmospheric effect by the time we're done. So that's the process I'm going to use from this point on. I'm going to keep adding value hues, particularly violets and yellows, and probably a little bit of red violet in here, because that's what my study showed, was a lot of red violet. I'm going to keep layering these things and alternating between just touching those highlights with pure white in places I want it to vibrate. And that's the process. I'm even going to do it down in here, but when I add a pale tint to this dark underneath is going to show through. I'm still going to be able to keep these value relationships going. This is a slightly paler violet, but because the blue, I'm not pressing so hard. Again, if I was mark making, I would leave spaces so that the darker blue that was, I think had probably a little bit of black in it, so it was a shade, a blue shade, those blue shades still come through. But I'm able to paint with the side and let those textures create those spaces that we're looking for. I put this on. I'm going to go to a red violet, which is a warmer tone, and it will marry well up against these things. Look at that. Look at that. Not going to fill in all that other blue violet, but I wanted to get those red violets in there and into this foreground, into this water. But look at that. Look how different that is, because I'm thinking in layers. I'm thinking in how to lighten this up. And I'll do some blending here with my finger because some of these areas are just still too dark. And I can blend over them. I still get some of that dark blue violet in there, but I can blend over them and control how much of that dark shows through over these lights. And I won't do that until I get the other colors on top, because I don't want to eradicate and lose the dynamic layering that white allows me to do. Here comes the white over the top. Now the white over the top works really well as the last layer in the highlight. But I'm putting the white over the top of those blue violets to lighten this line of trees a little. But it is not the top layer. I'm going to go back in here with my reds. I'm not trying to get a highlight in my shadows. So I'm not putting the pure white over those textured areas in a darker area to create a highlight. I'm wanting to keep the white as a way to manipulate the darks and keep them close to the highlighted area that will eventually have the white on all those ridges. This is my pale yellow again, and now I'm going in here and I'm being a little more deliberate on creating that variation. Now see, it's gotten real yellow, but again, this is the pure white, and those ridges are there, still there, and I can drag it across, and it keeps that yellow shining through, keeps that luminosity. If you want to think of a cloudy, rainy day with a fog coming across the lake, that there's luminosity, there is. It's all very subtle. So I'm going to keep doing this process for my lights and my darks and the middle tones, and I'll keep doing this process and probably go a little fast forward, and we'll take a look at the end result and maybe punch up a few places. But that's the process. So as I fast forward this, we'll continue to, you just continue to look at the methodology that I explained here about the different layers. Remember, the pure white's going to go on the end in our highlight areas, but the pure white is added underneath layers of dark in order to bring those up in value as we build the highlights and the foggy air above the lake and some of the foggy air that it will be on the lake. So that's where the white's on top, is in the lightest areas. The white is put on under the darks, but still shows through as we blend those and try to bring those values up so there's not a high contrast, particularly in a moody picture like this. Okay, so let me go fast forward and we'll talk a little bit near the end. So on with the forbidden. Oh, the taboo. I love the taboo. Woo-hoo. I wanted to stop. I used this kind of a hot pink. It's about a value 8. All these pale colors are 9 and 10, but this value 8, again, we're going to put. We use white, particularly in the areas that are the lightest. We use white over darker colors, darker hues. But see how it tames down, yet I still have those pure blues in my overhead sky. So I can drag this color through there and really warm this up. And I'm not neglecting, but I still keep those whites for those little $1 million cottages there. I love that, $1 million cottages. Oh my gosh, it's just a different world around these lakes. Okay, back to regular speed here. You've seen me do these layers. I'm going to give you a close-up, but there's really some super exciting things going on here in the layering. Now, to illustrate the piece de résistance, I don't know, I don't speak French. This is the white. As I said earlier, we reserve the white for hitting some of those highlights on that texture. Or if you were mark making, individual marks that allow most of that other color to show through. But by controlling the amount of white we put on, particularly since it's white against dark, then it's pure white, but there's those other colors going into it. And this is where the forbidden part comes in. They don't want you covering things with white because it will just lose its impact. So by judiciously adding white just to some of the textured highlight areas, I get an luminosity of those yellows coming through that we wouldn't get otherwise. They just wouldn't. Now I drug down in here and that was too much. It just wouldn't pop like it does. But through the years, we've heard, don't use white. But the truth is, if you learn to use white and you learn to use it correctly, it is an added tool in your box. The forbidden don't use white is way too pervasive. It's way too much of a myth that has to be debunked, because there's so many opportunities being missed by so many artists. And I'll soften that up a little bit. But there's our finish. There's using white, and it's just catching that textured area and allowing the yellows, the reds. I put some oranges in there too. The blue violets. There's just so much going on in there. I wanted to come in here a little closer and show you some of the red violets and blue violets, the warms and the cools playing off one another in those distant atmospheric areas. And that sky where the storm is starting to break to the west here. The clouds, the rain clouds are moving out, and you've just got the hope. This is about 10 o'clock in the daytime that I did the oil. That was an oil wash that I did in plein air. That was the study for this. This looks nothing like it, and I'm not going to let the plein air idea spoil this. So, but look at all those nooks and crannies. Oil on canvas, then covered with our clear gesso, then covered with pastel washes in multiple layers. There must be 15 different layers of color in here, from that yellow ochre oil that we started with to these red violets, blue violets, and this is now that first blue that I thought had a little black in it. It might still have some black in it, but it looks like it might have had some green, blue-green in there too. This is a close-up to the left side of this painting. You can see all that texture and all those multiple layers coming through there. That is so cool. Oh man, that is just gorgeous. That's just gorgeous. We can soften up some of those sharp edges underneath those. And so go find you some $1 million cottages across the lake on a rainy morning and try to capture that atmosphere. Well, there you have it. Hopefully you got something out of that. Please hit the like button. Even if you're a subscriber, it helps others find this information. So until next time, happy painting everybody, and try out that white technique and see if you can make some luminescent and some ethereal atmospheric effects that maybe you weren't getting by just using traditional techniques.